The boardroom smelled like stale coffee and file paper when the chairman folded his notes and called what they had done a matter of ethics. My name is Marcus Hale. I was 38 years old, and for 7 years I had led the AI and analytics group that transformed how the firm made decisions. I had built models, trained teams, and spent long nights tuning systems that rooted millions in revenue. At that moment, the fluorescent lights hummed above us, and the projector hummed a soft white noise that seemed to underline the word he kept saying. I remember the small details because they formed an outward evidence for an inward scrambling that I could not let become panic. My palms left a faint print on the leather armrests. The leather smelled faintly of wax and something sweet I could not name. The chairman's pen tapped twice against the wood like a metronome. Around the table were faces arranged in an etiquette of corporate curiosity, polite, cautious, rehearsed. I felt the weight of 7 years in the press of my suit at the shoulders, as if the fabric remembered the tens of thousands of hours and my body had catalogued them like a slow memory. I wanted to tell them the models were not secrets to be weaponized, that our work had been about clarity and fairness, not chicanery. The words crowded the back of my throat and stayed there. We were a compact team, the sort that grew into a way of being more than a department. In our conference room, someone always left a whiteboard half full with equations and sticky notes like confetti from some sober celebration. Sunday dinners at my partner's mother's house often stretched late because we would bring work with us and trade debugging stories like sailors swapping sea tailies. Our server rack occupied a corner of our bedroom and hummed at night. My partner joked that it was our third child. The server lights blinked a tiny, diligent heartbeat that comforted me on nights when production hiccups turned into all-night marathons. The physical presence of those machines, the smell of solder and warm plastic during maintenance, made the math tangible. I had been the quiet guy people came to when something broke. My hands had gotten used to tracing error logs until they turned into readable topography, to scanning model weights for the tiniest divergence and diagnosing it like a physician. I liked being quiet. Words had a way of twisting in meetings, but code did not lie unless we asked it to. We trusted processes more than politics. We documented every change, every model version, every retraining because we were obsessive about auditability. That compulsion was practical and moral. It was how we slept. Recognition for us was modest and often private. It came as unglamorous things, a nod in a quarterly review, a thank you email from a product manager whose launch had not derailed, a coffee bought by a colleague who had lost sleep because model drift had started to creep in overnight. The company floor applauded features and revenue milestones, not the scaffolding that kept decisions fair and defensible. Yet the recognition that mattered most to me lived in those private rituals. Late-night debugging sessions with pizzas that hardened, the relief when an A/B test finally showed expected lift, the way my lead engineer once came into my office with his hair disheveled and said, "We fixed the bias issue. We can sleep tonight." We took pride that the tools we built helped people. That belief steadied me more than a title ever could. So when the chairman folded his notes and invoked ethics, my mind rearranged the room into a stage I did not recognize. The phrase landed differently than a reprimand. It sounded like something rehearsed to absolve. I watched the chairman lower his glasses and did not notice if his fingers trembled. I watched colleagues look away with the kind of practiced neutrality that means either they were protecting themselves or they were waiting for direction. I felt my throat go dry and the air taste metallic. I thought of the server rack at home, the hum that had once felt like a lullaby, and the team's laughter echoing down the corridor after a rollout succeeded. Those small, private reliabilities had scaffolded my life. In the split seconds after he spoke, I cataloged the life that could be testified against me and the life that would be left unremarked. I went through the loops of conversations, the signed memos, the test plans, the granularity of our change logs, and found them all intact in memory. The belief that our systems reflected our intentions had felt literal. If ethics was now the charge, then I thought about every time we had documented a decision, every time a senior manager had asked for a parameter tweak for safety, and how we had written it down on a labeled change request. The dissonance pried at my calm. That morning the room had the impossible stillness of a place waiting for a verdict. Papers slid, coffee cooled, and someone coughed a polite, embarrassed sound. The word ethics folded over everything like a damp cloth. I felt not only confusion but the slow, cold arithmetic of possibility, that a lifetime of steady inputs could be summed into a single, damning label. That stability, the quiet routines, and shared faith in process was what made the blow feel like betrayal before it even landed. They accused me of crossing ethical lines after a senior executive found an irregular pattern in a model report. At first, it felt like a procedural misfire, an HR inquiry, a meeting with legal that would take an hour, and a refutation on paper. Then it escalated. Within days, I was escorted from the floor by security. I remember the chill of the badge scanner under my palm and the way the guard's expression was blank in the way people are when they have practiced detachment. A few colleagues peered from behind monitors as I walked past. Eyes flicked, then slid away. They handed me a letter that used the word breach the way a surgeon uses a scalpel: precise, final. The paper was thick, stamped with the company's crest, and the language was surgical phrases about unauthorized modification of decisioning systems, inappropriate access credentials, material risk to client outcomes. The version I was given read like an indictment written to sound inevitable. At the bottom, a line invited me to an exit interview with HR at the end of the week. The word breach hung in the air like smoke. I could feel the shape of it, how it would fill conversations and slide into meeting minutes, how it would render years of careful traceability into a single, ugly file. Back at my desk, what was left of my desk after the contents had been documented and itemized, colleagues who had shared beers with me in the break room found reasons not to pass by. People who had once knocked on my office door with an "Hey, you got a sec?" now pretended to be deep in their screens. There were polite, awkward smiles that didn't reach eyes, and a scattering of muted, pre-approved statements from compliance landing in team channels. "We take this matter seriously. We are cooperating with internal review. No further comment." A few managers quietly shifted projects away from our group. Meetings I had spent months preparing agendas for were reassigned. The practicalities of distance looked like a domino effect. The models we had been stewarding were labeled suspended, access revoked, client points of contact swapped out with a formality that felt rehearsed. Clients received reassurances about compliance even as contracts quietly shifted away. I watched account assignments change in the CRM tiles that had my name were reassigned, budgets altered, the rolling commitments siphoned toward other teams. It was clinical and efficient. It felt engineered to minimize exposure. The people I had worked with on integrations sent polite notes: "We appreciate your past help. Please direct future requests to the compliance channel." Beneath those dry exchanges, deals recalibrated and revenue streams evaporated like mist. The rumor mill did the rest, filling in edges with whispers and seat-of-the-pants certainty, manipulated outputs, hidden backdoors, deliberate favoritism toward certain partners. In the corridor, the whispers were soft but relentless, a static under the overview of corporate life. The most corrosive part was how quickly intimacy became suspicion. Engineers who had trusted me with late-night secrets of models and datasets now stepped around me. The joked familiarity of our stand-ups became stiff and guarded. One of my closest teammates avoided eye contact and asked if I had any private notes I wanted to take before I left. His voice was flat, and I realized he didn't know whether he was offering a kindness or protecting himself. I tried to explain clipped fragments, not the whole of what I knew, because I wanted them to understand that we had documented changes and approvals, and that nothing had been done without trace. The words felt small and misplaced in a room that suddenly spoke in memos. I sat in my car for a long time after they finally let me go. The interior smelled of old coffee and seat conditioner, and the cityscape outside moved in indifferent increments. On my phone, app after app lost privileges. My VPN token flagged as invalid, the admin console spat back an error, the single sign-on session expired and refused refresh. The little push notifications felt like tally marks being struck off a list: timed tokens, disabled APIs, revoked credentials. It was humiliating, the way my tools, the things that had been extensions of my hands and mind, turned into evidence of my supposed guilt through absence. Watching access tokens expire on a display the way a clock counts down was ridiculous and intimate. I felt the shrink of my professional personhood in the white glow of the screen. Calls to lawyers were flat, bureaucratic. They asked how much I wanted to spend on defense and whether I had copies of logs and changed tickets. I had backups at home and versions in my head, but right then I felt the disorienting slope of not knowing which way to point. At home, the server rack hummed behind the living room wall like a heartbeat I could no longer trust to be mine. My partner answered the door before I could knock. We had practiced scenes in my head how to tell them that an investigation was going to be inconvenient, that it might take time, that we'd weather it together. What I had not rehearsed was the specific look that crossed their face when I said the word breach. It wasn't anger or disbelief exactly, it was something like grief folded into fear. Their eyes went distant for a fraction of a second and then steadied in a way that made me feel like a stranger. I could read the calculus, mortgage, the server rack joked as a third child, the career milestones we had organized afternoons and vacations around, all of it revalued in a single ugly image. The look told me without preamble that our life would no longer be as we'd planned. It landed heavier than any corporate memo. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun. I was looking for anything that would explain the anomaly report, a timestamp out of place, a hand-edited note I had missed. I told myself that if I could just show the changed tickets, the code diffs, the approval threads, someone would have to listen. So I started where we always started, the archive. My thumb scrolled through years of thread headers, low-contrast strings of approvals, and canned subject lines. It's a strange thing, going back through your life in email, you notice what you used to say and how you used to say it. There was the polite corporate cadence, the shorthand we'd all agreed on in 1,000 meetings. And then, buried under a folder labeled Executive Closed, I found minutes that did not belong to the story they were trying to sell. At first it was small, a line item about safety margin experiments tagged as pilot, dated 3 months before the contract allocations shifted. I clicked, then clicked again. The document was a PDF with a set of signatures along the bottom, neat, scanned SIGs rather than cryptic Active Directory stamps. The signatures included names that I had seen on the firing letter. Their handwriting was the same, crisp, practiced, the kind of pen stroke a corporate leader favors when they want to look decisive. The memo language was careful in the way corporate language becomes careful when it protects something illegal. Authorize temporary adjustment to decision thresholds, it read. Label as experimental safety margins to monitor variance and partner impact. The gloss was clinical, the effect was not. I ran a mental translation, tweak the decision function's bias term to tip favorable outcomes toward preferred partners while claiming your testing robustness. In other words, institutionalized sleight of hand with a label that anyone could wave at auditors. I opened another file, then another. Meeting minutes from a closed strategy session, where one line item was a demonstration of how small parameter shifts would increase conversion rates for partner X by 13%. A side note handwritten scanned into the minutes said, approve implementation if legal okay. The legal sign-off came 2 days later, dated the same hour that a contract amendment with partner X was countersigned. The metadata on the scanned memos still had the original timestamps. Email headers showed approvals sent from the chairman's personal account rather than the secretary's, a signature block that matched the handwritten scrawl on the memo. There was a pattern and a clarity that made my stomach turn. Dates, signatures, and memo language all matched spikes in revenue allocation and coincided with the exact model output shifts the rumor mill had later characterized as my doing. Handwritten initials appeared in the margin next to phrases like prioritize partners and short-term yield to secure long-term relationships. The same phrase, experimental safety margins, had been used in 2 separate memos, signed by 2 separate executives, and repeated in an email chain that included the chairman and the CFO. Irony is too soft a word for what hit me then. The same board that had painted me as the sole violator had signed off on the manipulations. They had asked for plausible deniability and provided it to themselves with signatures and stamped memos. The document trail didn't erase my humiliation, but it reframed it. This was not a messy, independent coding mistake on my part. It was an arranged narrative with a scapegoat baked in. For a long time, I sat there with the PDFs open and the room spinning gently at the edges. Shock thinned into a focused calm and acuity that felt physical, like a muscle tightening around a bone. I thought of all the nights I had stayed late tuning models because the weight vector refused to converge, of the polite chats over coffee about where to set the threshold for false positives, of the way we had documented every change because we believed in traceability. I had spent a decade trusting traces to tell the truth, and now the traces themselves were the only truth I could find. I thought about the look on my partner's face when I had said breach and how quickly our life was repriced in a single glance. I thought about the young engineers who had depended on my candor, who had trusted that we wrote things down so someone could later explain them. If the board could write their way out of ethics, then the system we had built to enforce integrity had become a tool of obfuscation. That realization concentrated me. Betrayal turned into strategy. There was a slow, almost professional satisfaction that came with the discovery, the same one I get when a model finally converges after a long training run. The data had yielded its secret, but satisfaction was the wrong word. It was a cold recognition of method. These were not the blind, desperate acts of an engineer trying to game a system for personal gain. These were calculated corporate adjustments, documented and signed, designed to be defensible in the language of governance. I read the memos again, line by line, until the edges of the paper blurred. I cross-checked the timestamps against the public filings I could get my hands on and against the CRM changes I'd watched like weather from my desk. They lined up. The manipulations, the approvals, the contract amendments, everything bent toward the same conclusion. They had manufactured the story they needed, and then they had placed me in the center of it like a lightning rod. At first I felt angry in the way you expect, hot, speechless, a thing that makes you clench your fists. Then the anger cooled to something with a purpose. There are two ways you meet betrayal. You scream and make a scene, or you catalog it and decide on a course of action that increases the probability of truth coming out. I am an engineer. I instinctively chose the latter. I closed the laptop with the same care I used when shutting down production systems. I did not know yet what I would do with the memos, only that I had to do something with them. The discovery had removed the last fragments of disbelief and left me with a single, sharp thought. If exposing the truth would restore anything, my name, the trust of the people who mattered, or at least the record, then I would find a way to bring their approvals into the light. I set up a small lab in the guest room that had been my office when I still worked there. The rack at home hummed like a companion, racks of drives that my partner liked to joke about. I unplugged it from the house network, physically isolating the machines so nothing could phone home. The silence on an air-gapped system is different from quiet at the end of a workday. It is deliberate, almost ceremonial, the kind of silence you get when you do something that cannot be reversed. I started by cloning everything that mattered to multiple media and verifying the copies with checksums. I liked the ritual of it. Hashes provided the sort of irrefutable signatures I had always respected in our logs. Each archive had a manifest file with a SHA-256 string I could recite if necessary, a tiny promise that I had not altered what I had taken. I cataloged the memos, signature scans, and email headers in a folder tree that mirrored the corporate structure. Naming things carefully made them harder to lose in a panic later. Model artifacts required a different touch. The production environment used a mix of scheduled jobs, cached features, and a stateful drift monitor. When I reconstructed the logs, I spent an hour aligning timestamps to correct for time zone irregularities and daylight saving shifts, an exercise that felt absurdly domestic compared to the stakes. I recovered frozen commits, checked diffs line by line, and recreated the parameter files that an engineer would drop into a model to nudge bias terms. To be convincing, I had to rerun the models on sanitized historical data and show deterministically that a single edit in a threshold or bias produced the exact output pattern that had coincided with the contract shifts. Sanitization was its own moral and technical problem. I could not leak private client information. Every dataset I used for demonstration was redacted to the point of anonymity, but preserved the statistical properties that would make the manipulations reproduce. That meant creating synthetic but faithful inputs, seeding the random generators so that a skeptic could see the same effect if they attempted to replicate it. I recorded each run, timestamped the logs, and archived video captures of the model output changing as I toggled parameters back and forth. The change was never dramatic by eye. It was subtle math multiplied across millions of decisions until it became weighty in dollars. I built evidence packets for different audiences. For internal auditors and regulators, I prepared detailed timelines that linked signatures, email threads, and model diffs to specific financial outcomes. Each packet opened with a redacted executive summary and then let the documents do the talking. For journalists, I assembled a narrative deck that would make the case without dumping raw client data, a set of visualizations showing the before and after with clear captions and source citations. I even prepared a technical appendix explaining how the safety margin language could be implemented as a bias term in a decision function, because I had learned that clarity breeds credibility. I needed corroboration that could not be dismissed as fabrication. So I reached out to someone who still had access to certain records, a former colleague named Elise who had been careful about her contacts even after leaving. I did not use my usual accounts. I made contact through a burner address with a PGP key we had exchanged years ago for a private project. Elise responded after 3 days with a short sentence that felt like permission. She confirmed metadata I had not been able to extract from the scans, a server-side log entry and a folder name that matched a closed strategy session. She refused to open anything she did not already have access to, but she would check whether a particular signature appeared in the executive archive. When she sent back a photo of the archive index with the names circled, I felt a small, dangerous relief. Everything I assembled was redundantly labeled and intentionally boring. I stamped each file with a provenance note and a date. There was no flourish, no theatrical reveal file. I did not want an angry email to be mistaken for evidence. Instead, I created a stack of bland, immutable documents that together could not be shrugged off as coincidence. The work involved a kind of tedious artistry, matching header strings to memo images, correlating signed timestamps to contract amendment entries in the CRM, generating delta reports that quantified the financial impact to the penny. At 2 in the morning, I found myself debugging a visualization where the colors refused to represent the data. That felt almost comical until I remembered why the colors mattered. Loneliness settled around the project like dust. I told my partner I was doing freelance audits for a now-dormant client and let them leave me alone with a pot of cold coffee. Sitting through those nights, I kept thinking of the team I had trained, the junior engineers who asked me for code review and left with notebooks full of my handwriting. I wanted to clear my name for them as much as for myself. Each file I touched felt sacred and dangerous. I saved multiple copies in physically separate places because the world I was building evidence against knew how to make files disappear. When the packets were complete, I rehearsed the timeline I would present. I printed a sequence of documents and laid them out in order on the guest room floor. I moved them like someone arranging chess pieces, placing a memo here, a signature there, a timestamp aligned with a revenue chart. The pattern emerged precisely the way data always does when you give it enough care. Everything pointed back to the same approvals and the same people. The last thing I prepared was the demonstration itself. I packaged the sanitized dataset, the model binaries, and a scripted run that would reproduce the output divergence on a clean machine. I sealed the package with clear documentation on how the run would prove cause and effect. It would not be a shout, it would be a controlled, clinical replay that would let the numbers speak. I closed the case on the guest room floor, left it for a few hours, and then opened it again to make sure nothing had shifted. Perfection felt like a superstition, but I pursued it until the pile of papers no longer trembled under my hands. I slept for 3 hours and woke with a clear list of next steps. The setup was done, not yet the reveal. I carried the evidence to the locked storage box under the bed and slid the bolt home. Outside the house, the city moved as if nothing had happened. Inside, I felt the kind of readiness you only get after you have done everything you can do alone. I timed the swap for the morning of the quarterly meeting because rituals make people predictable. I had watched the calendar for weeks, traced patterns in when decks were uploaded, and when the AV team would push the final approval to the presentation server. The bank of processes they trusted was the same thing I had trusted for years, and that familiarity let me slip in without making a noise that would alarm the guards. I wrote a script that watched for the final sync and then atomically replaced the file pointer with my mirrored deck. The script verified checksums, logged its own actions, and then removed its footprints in a way that would make it look like a normal content refresh. The last step was a small flourish of theater, make it impossible to claim a mistake. I sat in my car across the street, the engine off because idling felt like announcing intent. My phone screen displayed a live internal feed that a contractor account could still access. Watching the room through a camera felt obscene, but it was also necessary. There was no crowd to rally and no camera crew to witness the moment. I was a ghost, watching a place I used to move through like a second skin. When the CFO shared their screen, the first few slides were what the board expected to see. Glossy KPIs, tidy charts, the familiar upward slop of performance that had earned polite applause in the past. I felt a brief, absurd pulse of nostalgia for the polished transitions we'd built into those templates. Then the CFO clicked, and the template revealed a page I had inserted between the nice numbers. A scanned memo with a signature in their handwriting and a stamped approval at the top. The room did not laugh or cough. There was a slow relocation of air as if everyone had simultaneously drawn breath and then held it. Slide after slide unfolded like that. I had layered the document images so that when the pointer landed on a particular chart, the annotation would appear beside it. There were email headers framed precisely where their eyes would rest and metadata footnotes that matched the archive indexes I had cataloged at home. The memos were not anonymous accusations. They were signed, dated artifacts with server-side timestamps that could be cross-referenced. The model diffs I had prepared flickered in the corner as small convertible animations, showing how a single bias term, toggled, produced the pattern that coincided with a spike in contract awards. I had written the code that produced those animations to run deterministically on the boardroom machine, using the cached client features the presentation suite always preloaded. It felt clinical and almost tender to see the math reveal itself on their screen. At first, people looked at the slides as if they were seeing a glitch. I had pushed the deck to look like it belonged there, so the initial reaction was confusion. The CFO tried to move on, fingers clicking, but the next click pulled up an email thread with internal distribution and a line I had highlighted that tied a safety margin phrase directly to a contractual amendment. Someone near the chairman made a small sound that could have been a laugh. It was not a laugh. It was a cough that had the pitch of panic. I had anticipated attempts to dismiss the files as fabricated. That was why each image had a provenance note embedded, and why I had included SHA 256 checksums in the footer of a later slide. If they did not want to look at the signatures, they could look at the hashes, and if they wanted to claim someone had planted the files, they would have to explain why the archive index on the executive server matched what I had printed in my packet. I could have left an explanatory note, but I did not. Letting the documents speak meant watching their faces try to interpret them. Phones buzzed internally. A chorus of muted notifications started in the room, the same sound I had trained myself to ignore during late-night deployments, but never now. Heads tilted down and then back up, eyes meeting other eyes in a chain of calculations. The chairman moved first, a practiced pivot toward control, and tried to reframe the slides as a recent issue to be deferred to the compliance team. His voice had the confidence of someone who buys control with repetition. That confidence cracked when the playback began. I had scripted a demonstration to replay a sequence of decisions as if the model itself were testifying. It was not a live networked model. That would have been messy and potentially criminal. Instead, I used the packaged binaries and the sanitized data I had run in my guest room, and I had set the presentation to play a recorded console of the model's decisions changing as the bias was toggled. The little numbers crawled across the screen and aggregated into a profit arc that grew at the same points the contracts had been amended. Overlaid annotations identified the exact memos that explained why the bias had been set at that time. The animation took less than 3 minutes and felt interminable. As the demo played, the room shifted from disbelief toward assessment. Some faces flushed, some whitened, and a few, the ones I recognized, turned toward each other and mouthed questions that did not need answers yet. The CFO leaned back and ran a hand through their hair. I imagined the internal math they were doing, the memory palace of decisions and excuses they would have to navigate in the coming hours. My chest was tight with a complicated happiness. This was not revenge for spectacle. It was an exposure so precise it could not be denied without admitting willful blindness. The chairman tried again to take control, to call for a temporary adjournment and a follow-up after the meeting with legal, but the room would not let him tame that moment. People already had phones in their hands, Slack channels lighting up, and a curiosity that does not respect authority. The silence that followed was as loud as any applause I had ever wanted. In the days that followed the boardroom replay, the initial shock congealed into a slow, inevitable unspooling. Resignations began as trickles and then became a stream. The CFO vanished first, citing personal reasons in a terse company statement. A week later, the chairman announced he was stepping down while an independent probe examined procedural irregularities. Legal firms with polished pitches arrived at the building like vultures circling a carcass. Regulators opened files, internal compliance launched an inquiry, and a special committee demanded access to the very archives I had spent months reconstructing. The air in the firm tasted of paper and deterrence. Some people who had been loud in my defense went quiet. A few who had spoken in measured tones about due process doubled down publicly, insisting that one exposure could not overturn an entire institution. That posture held for a while in blogs and talking head segments, until the timelines and cryptographic checksums rendered ideological defense impossible. Others slipped away without comment, their departure announcements couched in gratitude and best wishes. A handful of names I expected solidarity from reached out privately. Their messages were short, apologetic in tone, and heavy with relief. They were not sorry for me, they were sorry for themselves. Internally, my name was cleared faster than I expected. The committee could not argue with signed memos and server logs that bore their own fingerprints. I received a letter that stated my status was restored and that the company regretted the personal upheaval I had endured. The letter read like a legal instrument meant to soothe outside attention and not like a human reaching back to another human. I folded it 3 times and put it with the other envelopes in a drawer. Clearance felt like a technicality in a room that had already rearranged itself without me. The personal cost was not addressed in any memo. I lost the comfortable predictability that had shaped my days for years. Where I had imagined steady escalation and the familiar rhythm of sprints and releases, there was now a jagged landscape of interviews, follow-up meetings, and the occasional quiet scrutiny from former colleagues who wondered if their names might be next. Some friendships frayed in ways that were surprising because they came from small betrayals rather than grand denunciations. People I had trusted reacted like they had been told to, or like their own careers required distance. Those silent withdrawals cut deeper than any public statement. At home, the ritual of making dinner together became a kind of assessment. My partner tried to be pragmatic, balancing empathy with worry about our financial stability and the practicalities of healthcare and rent. I could see the calculations behind their eyes. There were nights when we sat on the couch and the server rack hummed in the next room as if nothing had changed. The joke about it being our 3rd child felt brittle and private. We argued over small things, and then we found our way back to each other in the quiet compromises of daily life. I was not absolved by their presence, but it was a tether that kept me from drifting into cynicism. I did not feel triumphant in the weeks that followed. The expose had been surgical and the outcome was real, but the landscape it exposed was messy. The firm lost credibility with clients who demanded explanations. A few contracts were renegotiated, and some partners walked away. The press file expanded into op-eds and investigative pieces that interrogated not only the signatures and memos, but also the cultural rot that allowed those memos to be wielded as tools. People began to ask difficult questions about governance, about who owned models and how accountability was distributed across departments. That scrutiny was necessary. It also made me painfully aware that systems reflect the people who touch them. There was a lesson in watching the aftermath unfold that kept returning. Ethics is not a poster on a wall. It is a set of behaviors and an architecture of accountability. Claiming the language of ethics while hiding approvals and orchestrating outcomes is cowardice dressed as virtue. People who sign memos and stamp approvals are responsible for the downstream effects of those signatures. That is banal and it is essential. The models we build do not invent values. They channel the preferences and compromises of the people who configure them. Oddly, in the middle of the professional rubble, a kind of clarity arrived. I no longer had to perform trust in an environment that had weaponized ambiguity. I had proof in plain sight and the weight of consequences followed. Clearing my name did not restore what had been broken, but it allowed me to choose what came next with a cleaner map of the terrain. Offers came, some from old contacts who had watched the episode with detached curiosity, and some from smaller firms who wanted someone who would never accept opaque approvals. I took none of them immediately. For a while I walked the city in the late light, thinking about how to rebuild not only my career, but the kind of work I wanted to do. In the wreckage of that chapter there was a quiet closure that felt less like victory and more like a resolved math problem. I had told the truth out loud and watched it travel through systems that pretended not to notice. That truth did not erase the betrayals or the nights of humiliation, but it unmoored me from the pretense that the institution I loved could be reformed from within without a reckoning. For the first time in months, I slept without checking an alert at 2 in the morning. The server rack still hummed, and when my partner joked about it being our 3rd child, I laughed and did not feel the need to explain why I had left the assembly of that household a different person. The papers would keep writing themselves for a while. I was left with the simpler business of living in the aftermath and with the steady conviction that I would not let silence be the currency that hides decisions.